A camera recorded Bigfoot doing something nobody believes when they see it. What began as a routine investigation turned into a clip of the Sasquatch doing the impossible. You're about to see proof that will make you believe that Bigfoot is real for the rest of your life. Stellan Vare had worked on investigative cases for 11 years. A timber called him 4 days after their bulldozer went missing from a contested logging site in the Six Rivers National Forest in Northern California. Not stolen, not broken down, but missing in the sense that pieces of it had been found in 3 separate locations and nobody could explain how they had gotten there or what had been strong enough to separate them from the rest of the machine. The first step was collecting the camera grid the logging crew had already installed. Before he even walked the terrain or studied topographic maps, Stellan drove the access roads and flagged each motion-activated trail camera the loggers had mounted around the worksite and along the road where the machine had last been confirmed operational. The company had placed them weeks earlier to document equipment activity and keep records during the dispute, which meant the cameras had been watching the area long before the bulldozer disappeared. Over the years, those cameras had captured bears wandering through cut blocks, vandals slipping past locked gates, poachers checking game trails, and the occasional lost hiker cutting through timber roads after dark. In 11 years of reviewing footage like that, they had never recorded anything that made Stellan sit in his truck and replay the same clip multiple times before he could bring himself to step outside. Camera 4 was positioned along the edge of a dense section of old-growth Douglas fir, mounted at chest height on a tree just off the service road that ran along the upper logging boundary. The footage was 1 minute and 39 seconds long. Stellan had watched it on the small screen of his laptop, parked at the edge of that same service road with the engine off and the afternoon light coming in flat through the windshield. How could less than 2 minutes of footage contain the answer to a mystery that had already scattered a bulldozer across the forest? The first seconds showed the road at the point where it curved past the tree line before opening into the staging area. The light was poor. A heavy overstory kept the ground mostly in shadow, with a few narrow shafts coming through at angles, shifting slightly as the branches moved in a high wind that couldn't quite reach the ground. For the first 2 seconds, there was nothing. Then something moved in the shadows between the trees, and Stellan felt his body go still in a way it did not usually go still. What kind of thing moves through a dark forest at that size and that speed and doesn't bother to stay in the shadows? A Sasquatch stepped into one of the narrow shafts of light, and the light was enough. It was upright. It was massive. Reddish-brown hair covered it from head to foot, dense and layered, the coat thickest across the shoulders and upper back, where it bunched and shifted with each stride. It moved with the kind of weight that you don't fake, not the performed heaviness of someone trying to walk large, but the deep structural weight of something that has never once in its life needed to consider what might be bigger than it. Every step compressed the road surface with a finality that had nothing theatrical in it. Stellan's first thought, embarrassingly, was that the camera had malfunctioned. Some trick of the lens, a compression artifact, something that would resolve into a bear or a downed tree if he just let it settle. His second thought arrived about a half-second later, when the full figure came into the light and the scale of it became undeniable, and that second thought had no words attached to it. His hands had gone still on the laptop keyboard. He was not aware of deciding to stop moving. He just had. If the footage wasn't a malfunction, then what exactly was Stellan watching walk across the same road he was parked beside? 8 feet tall, at minimum. He had done enough outdoor work, enough time measuring elk trails and bear markings against known reference points, to have a decent eye for height and scale, and he had never been far off. This was 8 feet, possibly a shade more, and he arrived at that number without having to think hard about it. The dead fir it passed at 11 seconds gave him his reference. The top of its head cleared a branch he could later measure at 7 feet 9 inches from the ground. The shoulders were the part that most resisted any effort to file it under something normal. A human being, even a very large one, has shoulders that fit inside a certain range, a range defined by the width of the skeleton beneath them, by the limits of what muscle can do to that frame. These did not fit inside that range. They were impossibly wide, rolling forward slightly with each stride in a way that suggested the whole upper body was built around a different set of proportions entirely. And the arms that hung from them were long in a way that had nothing to do with any human proportion Stellan had a reference for. They swung past the knees in a slow, heavy rhythm, each pendulum arc covering more distance than it should, the kind of rhythm that belongs to something that covers a lot of ground with very little effort, something that has never needed to hurry because hurrying has never been the point. If this forest was its territory, how long had it been watching the machines come through and tear it up? And how long had it been deciding what to do about them? Stellan watched it and noticed where it was going, the staging area. The bulldozer sat at the far edge of the service road where the crew had left it the previous evening, blade down, engine cold, sitting on the same packed gravel it had been sitting on when the operator signed off. The Sasquatch was walking directly toward it, with the same purposeful, unhurried gait it had held since the moment it entered the frame. There was no detour, no hesitation, no slowing to assess the open ground or the unfamiliar terrain of the cleared road. It was walking toward that machine the way a person walks toward something they have already made a decision about. The decision had been made somewhere else before the camera ever picked it up, and what was happening now was simply the execution. The gait was unhurried. That detail landed harder than the size. A Sasquatch that large, moving in the open along a service road, and there was no urgency in it at all. No scan of the terrain, no checking of angles, none of the low-level alertness that wild animals carry through their bodies even at rest. Why would a wild creature move across an open road without even the smallest trace of caution? Wild animals are always, on some level, listening. Even the ones at the top of the food chain have something residual in them, some background process running beneath behavior, keeping a loose inventory of the environment. Bigfoot had none of that. It moved through the space the way you move through your own house in the dark, unhurried and unafraid, because every part of the space is already known. This was the pace of something that knew exactly where it was going and had no particular reason to rush. At 18 seconds, Bigfoot slowed, just slightly, and its head turned, not toward the camera, toward the staging area ahead where the machine sat in the fading afternoon light at the edge of the cleared ground. It held that angle for about 2 seconds, then turned back and kept walking. The motion was so specific and so calm that Stellan watched it 3 times before he allowed himself to move on. Not assessment, not curiosity. It already knew the machine was there. The head turn was something else, the particular quality of attention you give to something you have been thinking about for a while and are now almost close enough to reach. Stellan had seen that quality in human subjects on surveillance footage. He had not expected to see it here. At 31 seconds, the service road passed under a gap in the canopy where a large tree had come down at some point, and the wider beam of light that came through that gap caught the hair across Bigfoot's shoulders in detail. Individual strands moved in a faint breeze, each at its own speed, the longer ones catching more air and moving further, the shorter ones barely shifting. It was the movement of real hair on a living body, not costume material, not anything synthetic, but actual biological material, each strand independent, responding to a small amount of air moving through the forest the way any animal's coat would respond to it. Stellan had worked enough wildlife cases to know what hair looked like on a large animal in natural light, and what he was seeing in those 2 seconds matched that in a way that he could not argue himself out of. It kept walking. The bulldozer was visible now at the far right margin of the camera's field. The wide blade, the upper cab structure, the bulk of the machine sitting exactly where the crew had left it. Bigfoot moved into the cleared staging ground, and the camera held its full profile. The cone-shaped skull, the heavy brow ridge above the flat face, the wide shoulders rolling forward in that consistent stride. It was still moving without any change of pace. It had not slowed. It had not stopped to evaluate. Whatever it intended to do when it reached that machine, the decision was already behind it, made and settled somewhere in the dark hours before dawn. Not something it was still working out. as it crossed the open ground. If the decision had already been made hours earlier, what had convinced it that the bulldozer needed to be dealt with? At 45 seconds, Bigfoot stopped. The stop was total, not a slow deceleration, not a shift of weight, but an immediate halt, the way a body stops when it has arrived at the thing it came for. It was standing at the front of the bulldozer. The machine came up to roughly its mid-chest. Stellan had the dimensions of a bulldozer memorized from the case file. Operating weight around 20,000 pounds. Blade width 14 feet. Cab height just under 10 feet to the exhaust stack. He held those numbers in his head and looked at the Sasquatch standing in front of it and felt something happen in the back of his mind that was not comfortable. Then the head turned, not toward the machine, toward the camera. It found the lens with the same precision it had found its destination, directly, without a search, without the half-second of scanning that would have been present if it hadn't already known where to look. Bigfoot's eyes found the lens and held it. How long had it known the camera was there before it decided to look at it? The expression on the face was not what he would have expected. There was no startle in it, no alarm, none of the wide-eye tension that comes through clearly on any large mammal when it encounters something unexpected. The expression was flat, unreadable in the specific way that a face becomes unreadable when the emotion behind it is something unfamiliar. Not the absence of expression, but an expression that had no match in anything Stellan knew how to read. If the creature wasn't surprised by the camera or the machine, then what exactly had it come here expecting to find? If he had to name it, and he resisted doing so, he would have called it acknowledgement. The eye contact lasted 3 seconds. Midway through those 3 seconds, there was a small movement in the irises, a slight shift in the direction of gaze, not dramatic, not a full look away, but the micro-movement that happens when a brain is actively working behind the eyes. Bigfoot was not staring, not frozen, but processing the camera with the same deliberate efficiency it had applied to everything else in its path. Whatever the camera represented, the evaluation was brief. It had been located, classified, and deprioritized in the span of 3 seconds, and then it was simply no longer the focus. That kind of response, finding a thing, deciding about it, continuing, is not the behavior of instinct. Instinct is louder and less precise. What happened at 45 seconds was a decision. After 3 seconds, Bigfoot turned back to the machine. Stellan stayed on the frame, the moment just after the eye contact ended and the Sasquatch turned its attention back to the bulldozer. For a long time, the way you stay on a frame when some part of you is hoping the pause will give the image somewhere else to go. He had reviewed hundreds of hours of trail camera footage over 11 years. He had seen wildlife, vandals, trespassers, livestock. He had a working vocabulary for what human damage looked like and what animal damage looked like and where the boundary between them sat. He had never once, in 11 years, expected to need a category on the other side of both of those things at once. If the answer to the bulldozer damage didn't fit human behavior or animal behavior, what exactly had Stellan been hired to investigate? At 59 seconds, it started. Bigfoot placed both hands against the front blade of the dozer. Not a strike, a placement, deliberate and measured, with the flat of both palms against the upper edge of the steel, fingers curling slightly over the lip. There was no wind-up. There was no gathering of effort, no widening of the stance, no visible bracing. The body didn't shift. It just applied force, and the blade moved. Stellan watched it and thought about the numbers. To move something that heavy from a standing position with no leverage, no running start, no equipment of any kind, through the application of hand pressure alone, he could not finish the calculation in a way that came out as possible. He watched it happen on the screen anyway. The machine rocked backward. Not dramatically, not a catastrophic lurch, a single authoritative rock, the tracks on the far side lifting a few inches off the ground before the weight came back down. The settling impact when it came back down was audible on the microphone. Bigfoot had not moved. Its feet were in the same position. Its posture was the same. It had pushed 20,000 pounds backward a measurable distance without leaning into it, and whatever that had cost it was not visible anywhere on its body. Then it gripped the blade and pulled. The sound the microphone captured at 1 minute and 4 seconds was not a sound Stellan had a reference for. It was metal under stress, the particular dense, tearing quality of structural steel separating at points it was not designed to separate at, layered over a lower, sustained groan that was the frame of the machine responding to a force it had not been engineered to withstand. If the frame of the bulldozer was already failing under the strain, how much more of it could the creature take apart? The blade came away in 2 pieces. The first piece went somewhere to the left, out of frame. The second piece the Sasquatch held in one hand, examined briefly in the way you examine a thing that has just come apart in a manner that surprises you slightly, and then set down on the ground beside the machine with a precision that was almost careful. He replayed those 4 seconds 6 times. What he was looking for, what part of his brain kept insisting had to be there, was some visible exertion in the body, some shift of the hips, some drop of the shoulder, some change of breath visible in the chest or the rib cage. In any large animal under load, you can read the effort. The spine curves toward the resistance. The legs drive into the ground. Something moves that tells you the body is working against something that requires working against. None of that was present. The Sasquatch had removed a steel blade from a 20,000-pound dozer, and the only thing that changed in its body was the position of its arms. Stellan had no explanation for that. He had no framework that could hold it. He just watched it again, and the footage kept showing him the same thing it had shown him every previous time. If the evidence refused to change no matter how many times he replayed it, how was he supposed to explain it to the people who had hired him? He looked at the paused frame on his laptop screen, the machine with its blade gone, the Sasquatch standing beside it with what had been solid welded structural steel lying in 2 pieces in the gravel, and thought about every equipment damage case he had worked that ended with a clear explanation, and how none of them had pointed anywhere near here. Most equipment damage in wilderness had one of 4 causes: vandalism, weather, mechanical failure, or transportation accident. He had never once, in 11 years, needed a 5th category. He sat in the truck for probably 2 minutes without moving, and then he started the clip again. Bigfoot moved down the left side of the machine. The same unhurried gait, the same absence of urgency, walking the length of the dozer the way a person walks the length of something they are inspecting and taking inventory of. At the track assembly, it stopped and crouched, and Stellan lost the upper body to the camera angle. And then there was a sound like a rifle shot, and the camera image shook from the vibration of it, and when the Sasquatch stood back up and kept walking, it was carrying a section of track chain that weighed, by Stellan's later estimate, somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds. It carried it one-handed, the chain hanging in a loose loop from its fist, swinging slightly with each stride in the way things swing when they are being carried by something that does not find their weight particularly notable. It stood at the far end of the machine and held still. It had done something deliberate, and now it was simply standing with the chain at its side, upright and without any shift of weight, in the specific stillness that is different from rest. Not the stillness of something that has stopped because it is tired. The stillness of something that has stopped because it is done with one part and is now considering the next. If this was only one step in a process, what part of the machine would it decide to remove next? The force required to produce what the microphone had captured was not something he could talk himself past. He had worked enough outdoor cases to have a working understanding of what a large body in motion sounds like when it connects with a solid surface, when it bends steel, when it removes load-bearing components from machinery designed to operate in the harshest available terrain. What he had heard from 1 minute and 4 seconds onward was not close to anything a human being was capable of producing without cutting equipment, without time, without preparation of any kind. The effort simply did not register on the Sasquatch's body. Nothing changed in its face. Nothing changed in its posture. It had torn the blade off a 20,000-pound machine and removed a section of track assembly and was now holding 500 pounds of chain in one fist, with the same affect as someone holding a set of car keys. It swung what it had removed as if this required roughly the same amount of attention as opening a door, and then it stood and looked at the rest of the machine, and the expression on its face was the particular blankness of something that is deciding what comes next. If removing a bulldozer blade registered the same way opening a door did, what would actually constitute effort for something like this? The waiting was the part that resisted any clean explanation. This was not random destruction. It was not territorial aggression in any documented form. It was not feeding behavior. It was something that looked, from the outside, like work. A job being done with professional composure by something that knew exactly what it was doing and had no need to rush through it. Bigfoot had arrived at a specific machine and was working through it with the methodical attention of something that had a clear idea of what it wanted the end state to look like. All of that had the shape of intention, of a plan formed somewhere else in the dark and the quiet of this forest, and now simply being executed one component at a time with no wasted motion and no visible exertion. Stellan had been on enough investigative calls to know the difference between damage caused by force and damage caused by intention. Force leaves patterns that are directional and predictable. The vectors of an impact, the trajectory of a slide, the failure points of metal stressed beyond its rating. Intention leaves patterns that are selective. A machine stripped of specific components, left in a specific condition, arranged in a way that suggests the end state was the objective from the beginning. What Camera 4 had captured had the shape of intention, from the moment the Sasquatch placed its palms against the blade to the moment it stood with the track chain in its fist. And it was the most unsettling thing Stellan had encountered in 11 years of work that occasionally turned up unsettling things. He thought about that while he watched the clip a second time. The components had been removed in a sequence that made a kind of structural sense. The blade first, which bore the weight of the forward end. The track section next, which compromised the machine's mobility. If you wanted to disable a bulldozer permanently, if you wanted to render it irreparable rather than merely inoperative, that was roughly the order in which a knowledgeable person would work. He did not know what to do with the implication of that. He set it to the side and kept watching. If the sequence mirrored how a trained operator would disable a machine, how did the Sasquatch know where to start? At 1 minute and 14 seconds, the tree line on the far side of the staging area moved. Not the way wind moves a tree line, not a general wave-like shift of branches and upper canopy. The movement was low and specific, the kind that comes from a large body pushing through dense brush, and it happened at a single point in the tree line directly across the staging area from where Bigfoot stood. A second Sasquatch stepped out. Stellan's first impression was size, and his second impression was that his first impression had been wrong because he had used the first Bigfoot as his baseline for large. The second Sasquatch was bigger, noticeably, significantly bigger. He estimated somewhere between 9.5 and 10 feet, broader across the chest and shoulders, the coat darker, almost black in the shadows at the edge of the staging area, and shifting toward a very deep brown, only when it moved far enough into the light. Each step carried a mass that was visible in the way the ground responded, in the way the gravel compressed and shifted with each footfall. If the first one had already dismantled part of the machine alone, what could the larger one do when it reached it? It moved directly to the dozer cab. No inspection, no pause. It gripped the cab structure at the roofline with both hands, and what it did next happened in the same quiet, businesslike way everything had happened since the first Bigfoot walked into frame. The cab came off the frame, not twisted, not folded, separated cleanly at the mounting points, lifted away from the machine as a unit, and set down on the far side of the clearing with the same considered placement the first Sasquatch had used when it set down the blade section. The roll cage was still intact, the seat was still inside it. The whole assembly sat upright on the gravel, and the machine beneath it was open to the sky, its internal workings exposed to the forest air, as if the cab had simply been removed for maintenance by someone who knew exactly which bolts to pull. The two Sasquatches stood in the staging area and faced what remained of the dozer. There was no sound between them on the microphone, no vocalization, no clicking, no signal of any kind. They stood in the remaining light with the stripped machine between them, and they were still, and whatever was happening between them did not require sound. If they weren't communicating out loud, how had they coordinated the work so precisely? Then the larger one looked up. It found the camera immediately. The head came up and the eyes went directly to the lens without a scan, without a search, without the delay that would have been present if it didn't already know where to look. It held eye contact for 3 seconds, the same duration as the first Sasquatch, and the expression Stellan saw on its face across that brief span of footage was not curiosity. It was not alarm. It was something that he kept turning over in his mind on the drive back south and could not find a better word for than acknowledgement. Not surprise that the camera was there, not aggression toward it, something closer to the look a person gives when they notice they are being watched and want you to know they noticed. The clip ended, 99 seconds of footage, and Stellan had no idea what to do with any of it. If the creatures knew they were being watched, had the camera captured exactly what they wanted someone to see? The Halverson equipment had been at that site for 3 weeks. Whatever had been decided about it had been decided somewhere in that window, in the old-growth forest above the staging area, in the dark, with no documentation of any kind, no record of the deliberation, no way to read the outcome, until Camera 4 picked up the result in 1 minute and 39 seconds of footage. This was not a territorial behavior that happened to be caught on camera. It was a territorial behavior that was delivered to one. They had not been surprised by his equipment. They had used it. The destruction was not something that Stellan's investigation had uncovered. It was something that had been staged for his investigation, or for whoever came after him, or for the footage to eventually reach whoever at the Halverson Timber Company had the authority to decide whether the machines went back in.